So the final results of the Instituto Brasileiro de Geografia e Estatística census came out, and the numbers were much lower than expected. I'm surprised by how people either celebrate or don't pay attention to this factor. Last year, I made videos warning about demographic stagnation and how it will be catastrophic for Brazil. At the time, I worked with the estimates that existed up until then. In 2012, the population was 193 million. We expected that by the beginning of 2020, we would enter this decade, the 2020s, with 215 million people. But the preliminary data from 2022 indicated that, in fact, it would be 207 million people, which was already quite discouraging, but now what was bad got even worse, because the final result was 203 million people. In this video, I will divide it into two parts. In the first, I explain how we got to this demographic crisis that will turn into a huge economic crisis, and in the second, why this will be the mother of all crises. On the screen, I'm showing the population projections that indicate what was expected by various agencies before the Instituto Brasileiro de Geografia e Estatística results. If you look at this chart, you'll see that it was expected that the Brazilian population would enter a phase of population stagnation between 2040 and 2045. And from there, it would start to decline from 2045, then accelerate from 2050. When I made the video, Why I Don't Bet on Brazil, I said that every time an update of the estimates came out, it would bring this phenomenon forward year by year. So I imagined that the updates in the next 3 or 4 years would move the population stagnation forward, bringing it to between 2035 and 2040. But it's even worse than I imagined, because we'll probably see this population stagnation happening as early as 2030. Falling before 2035, so if Brazil had 25 years to prepare, in reality we don't even have 10. And what people don't understand about this stagnation is that it will be the mother of all crises, because from it we'll have a series of other crises derived from it. It will be like a house of cards. And another thing they forget to mention is that this stagnation isn't due to high mortality, but to low birth rates. So it's a population that stays the same in number, but at the same time becomes less productive and more costly, because we'll have fewer and fewer young people to generate enough wealth to support these older people. A lot of people say this isn't so bad because it's also happening in other countries in Europe and Asia. And I really don't understand why something this bad wouldn't be considered serious just because it's happening there too. And here, bad is bad, but there's a substantial difference in why it will be worse here than there. And the reason is that there, the population aged in countries full of infrastructure, industry, and technology. Here, people aged with basically the same infrastructure that existed at the end of the 70s. We will have an old population like Japan, but living in a country where much of it has the infrastructure of an underdeveloped country. So it's more serious. This phenomenon is happening mainly in developed countries, and just like here, the ones to blame for this disaster are the so-called baby boomers, who are the generation born between 1945 and 1964. This generation literally caused social damage that will carry on into the 21st century. The entire century to be fixed. And here I need to add something, because a lot of people, especially the baby boomers themselves, will complain to me. When I assign blame to this generation, it's done collectively and not individually, obviously. So if you're from this generation, you don't need to freak out saying that it's not your fault. Geopolitics deals with generalized aspects, so within the general context, we can assign blame to the baby boomers as a collective, but obviously not to individuals. So pay close attention to that. This baby boomer generation in general loves to quote something that is historically wrong, but it serves to illustrate the collective mentality of this generation, which is that phrase, strong men create good times create weak men create bad times create strong men, create. This phrase is wrong in many ways because the world simply isn't cyclical in such a simple, simplistic, and superficial way, since you only need to look at the situation in the United States and Argentina. If we apply this simplistic view, we would see that Argentina has been getting poorer for a century. They would basically be stuck in what would be generations of weak men producing hard times, which would produce even weaker men who would produce even worse times. Whereas the United States between 1800 and 2010 was the only nation that entered the following decade stronger than in the previous decade. So they were in a reverse spiral. So this idea of strong men and weak men with good times and bad times is completely unfounded. Each case needs to be selected and separated in different contexts. But, as I said, it serves to illustrate the mentality of the baby boomers, because this generation of people born between 1945 and 1964 believes that they would have produced the good times and that today people are weak. But in reality, the peak time in human history in the production of material and immaterial wealth that happened between 1950 and 2000 was not the work of the baby boomers. In that 50-year period, they were children, teenagers, or even young adults who were not fully involved in state decisions and planning. So they lived through this time of wealth, but only started to actually take on leadership positions when they began to reach over 50 years old. In some cases, 40, which started from the 1980s onward. So by their own logic, they would be the weak people who are producing bad times. But as I said, history is not cyclical in the way they imagine, being separated into just 4 stages. But in fact, the blame for the 21st century becoming economically stagnant or poorer, it will be their fault. São Paulo was not turned into an ugly city. And dystopian, which looks like it came straight out of a RoboCop movie, with buildings that have been taken over covered in graffiti, and with crime since 2010, it all started back in the 80s. People who are 20 to 30 years old today didn't create the public and security policies that led to this situation. Rio de Janeiro didn't become a version of Mexico, with the police unable to enter many parts of the city just since 2010. It actually started back in the 80s, and from then on, things only got worse. It's also not the fault of people who are 20 or 30 years old today, since back then they were just kids or teenagers and had nothing to do with the disastrous public security policies of the state. The Northeast has faced issues of violent crime, poor infrastructure, and underdevelopment since before 2010. Since 1960, when Brazil's economy was booming, no one focused on developing the region. You can't blame people who are 20 or 30 years old, or even those who are 40 or just turned 50, for not having invested in infrastructure and education. And baby boomers around the world are being blamed for making the 21st century so difficult, but the baby boomer generation in Brazil is much worse than in other countries. Because if you look at the 60s and 70s, it was almost unanimous that Brazil would be the country of the future, while Singapore, for example, in the 60s, basically suffered the effects of being one of the few cases in history of a territory that was practically expelled from a country. After all, Brazil had a young population, rapid growth, plenty of natural resources, and a continental size, while Singapore was a small city with no resources and a population, let's say, of undesirables, of Chinese refugees. But Brazil didn't invest enough in education and science, didn't build a road network, didn't create enough energy generation and distribution, and things got even worse with the 1988 Constitution, which promises almost everything as a result of the demands of the baby boomers. Singapore desperate, invested in its only resource, human capital. It invested heavily in education, thinking about the next generation. And as a result, today it is a technological hub and even a high-tech industrial center. And before anyone says that Singapore was an easy case because it's just a city, what I said applies to several larger countries in more complex situations like South Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam, Australia, and so on. So almost every country in the world grew between 1950 and 2000, but some spent what they earned and others invested for the long term. And the Brazilian baby boomers, from the moment they started taking on state leadership positions in Brazil, from 1980 onwards, didn't focus on long-term planning and strategy, but on creating a sea of benefits and bureaucracy to feed themselves. Because look, the baby boomer generation, whether in the United States or in Brazil, was part of the biggest population explosion in the history of humanity. When they were young, in their 20s to 40s, in democracies, they voted for policies that benefited them. And in dictatorships like Brazil and Argentina, they didn't vote. But the military leaders gave social benefits to calm that youth and thus avoid uprisings. Whether it was low-cost or free higher education, strong family support systems and social welfare, or, in the Brazilian case, the start of the public service job boom with job stability and early retirement funded by the state, when these generations reached the peak of their careers, now between 50 and 70 years old, it was the 1990s and 2000s, and their voting patterns would change again. Now, this large block of voters supported laws that protected the elderly because they knew their time to retire was coming. So whether it was priority in services, parking spaces, preferential seating, tax exemptions, lower taxes, half-price tickets for events, and so on, and most importantly, things like zoning laws that would protect the value of their properties. Just like the baby boomer generation created a whole set of laws that guarantee benefits for the elderly, which would be them starting in 2010, but unlike developed countries, they didn't create infrastructure, education, or industry. The generations that came after won't have access to these same benefits. So basically, the baby boomers, born between 45 and 64, will have their benefits paid for by generations that will never have access to those same benefits. Anyone who is between 20 and 40 years old today has almost no hope of ever retiring, unless they have a government job, and with luck, they'll die before becoming disabled. The baby boomer generation experienced almost 30 years of consecutive growth in Brazil. But since they took over the leadership positions in the 80s, they changed Brazil's focus from being industrialist to becoming just a rentier exporter of commodities. Brazil went through 4 decades, 1 decade of growth, the 2000 US, 1 of stability, the 1990s, and 2 of crisis, the 1980s and the 2010s. Based on current indications, the 2020s are likely to be another lost decade. The generation of people born after 1970 will have to build the infrastructure that the generation born between 1945 and 1964 did not create, and still support that generation while they are retired. And all this with far fewer resources than that generation had, and on top of that, in a world that is more unstable and hostile than that period. And by the way, it's unstable and hostile precisely because the baby boomer generation around the world mixed ideology with geopolitics, abandoning pragmatism. And before anyone thinks I'm making excuses for the younger generations, I'm really not, because I'm genuinely concerned about the generations that came after, including my own, but I'm even more concerned about the generations born after the year 2000, especially because their average intelligence quotient for the first time in history will be lower than that of previous generations, and they are literally the result of cultural engineering. So this demographic crisis is literally a kind of great filter, because for the first time in all of human history, we will have to deal with this. Because it's the first time we have a life expectancy that reaches 80 years and the birth rate is below 1%. And, a lot of people think it's just a matter of the cost of living, but the truth is that in most of the world, a real anti-natality culture has taken to hold. This has to do with costs, obviously, but it also has to do with lack of interest, with space, with big cities increasingly pushing people, the population, into apartments of less than 20 square meters. It has to do with bureaucracy. It has to do with the state itself interfering in people's lives to hinder a series of policies that confuse young people's minds and so on. Even environmentalist speeches that celebrate low birth rates to supposedly save the planet in proposals that seem to me like literal collective suicide. It's not the first time in human history that we've had population stagnation. We've seen this population plateau several times, which is actually the rule, with population growth being the exception. But now it's different, because it's the first time we've had population stagnation not due to high mortality, but because of low birth rates combined with high life expectancy. And this will be the mother of all crises, because it will lead to other crises. First, what I mentioned about the social cost we will have to bear to support an aging and unproductive population. And this will be aggravated by the welfare policy that exists here in Brazil. Today, there are approximately 50 million people who receive Bolsa Familia. But the real problem is that the government is proud of this, when in fact this is the result of the failure to turn this quarter of the population into productive citizens. And if the government is proud of this, then it will do nothing to change this reality. Second, most of this aging happens precisely, and not by chance, in the big cities. Sul is already suffering from previous depopulation, and the situation will worsen significantly. Anyone who has ever been a building manager knows that most of the cost comes from maintaining a building. And as we see this sea of tiny apartment buildings, but at the same time highly expensive, it becomes clear that there will be a lack of people to pay for the basic infrastructure of these buildings, which will probably go through rapid deterioration. Whether it's because some of the residents will depend on government handouts like pensions and retirement benefits, which won't be enough to maintain their standard of living, or even cover the basics. And on top of that, there will also be many empty units. And empty units in the condominiums make their costs fall on the other paying residents who have to make up for this budget gap from these apartments. So we'll have real estate bubbles combined with the deterioration of urban spaces. The third is that we'll have more and more psychological illnesses, and the older and poorer population will probably depend more and more on medications like antidepressants. The fourth is the productive crisis, because with an aging population, we'll have a reduced workforce and a smaller tax base, which will lead to a decline in economic growth, increased burden on social security systems, and greater challenges to sustain welfare and retirement programs. A lot of people hope that artificial intelligence and technology will solve this, but they forget that these elements aren't solving the problem in countries like Japan, Germany, and South Korea, which are highly advanced in technology. And robotization, then the situation will be worse in Brazil because it's not even remotely close to having the level of technology and robotization that these countries have. So even if technology could save us, and it won't, this wouldn't apply to Brazil. This economic crisis is already being felt as a crisis in education, because with a declining population, we'll have fewer children of school age and also fewer young people in universities, which will lead to the closing of schools and colleges. And this is a reality that has been further aggravated by the Partido dos Trabalhadores Party's policy of distributing diplomas through government-sponsored corner universities that didn't provide education in the literal sense of knowledge, but rather diplomas of questionable quality. Fifth, we'll have a crisis in the healthcare system because with an aging population, there will be an increased demand for healthcare services, especially for age-related conditions like chronic and degenerative diseases. And both the public and private healthcare systems are already practically saturated. Sixth, we'll have a crisis in innovation and productivity because an aging population has a negative impact on innovation rates, with fewer people of working age and a lower birth rate. This could probably lead to technological stagnation, which I've already warned about before in other videos. Seventh will be the political and social crisis because the demographic crisis will trigger racial, cultural, religious, social, and political tensions. We're seeing this more and more in Europe and the United States, but make no mistake, we'll see situations like this here as well. The eighth is the infrastructure crisis, because with a lack of professionals and resources, the existing infrastructure will deteriorate if it doesn't get the proper attention, making the other crises I mentioned even worse. Obviously, there are more crises that will come as a result of the population crisis, but these are the ones I think are most visible for now, especially since the video is already quite long. Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave your opinion about what you think of this future demographic crisis in the comments because I'll read them all. And don't forget to subscribe and share the video with everyone you know. Your support is essential for me to keep bringing you analysis, geopolitics, and history. Hugs, and see you in the next video. Subtitle Adriana